I've been driving cars for 40 years. If you've got minutes to spare, I'm gonna share you everything that I've learned. See, along that time, we all realize that you buy a domestic car, a truck, that usually comes at a cheap price. It's affordable, but it does a lot of work and it's cheap to fix. You buy an Asian car, Hondas, Toyotas. They're cheap, they're affordable, they're reliable, and they'll run forever. You buy a European vehicle. It's gonna be far more interesting to drive, fun and exciting, but it's gonna be very expensive to look after. Okay, that's a very overgeneralized statement, I know. And in 40 years, I've learned a lot more than that. I can probably ask each and every one of you what you've known about the car industry, what you've learned. And it probably deviates from that substantially. As a matter of fact, things that I've learned in the last little while go far beyond those generalized expectations or assumptions. See, because domestic products, there was a time when they were the cheap, affordable vehicle. Well, things have changed. They're not affordable anymore, and they're definitely not cheap. They also break like anything European, and now what I've realized is a lot of European vehicles now are, in many cases, even more reliable than many of the domestic products. I never also thought there'd be a time that cars like Toyotas, Hondas, Mazdas would have reliability problems, that they'd be more complex than yesterday's Jaguars or Range Rovers. But things have changed a lot. And in all my time driving, I've realized cars, they meet the criteria for people in different ways. Some things that I've learned along the way, that if there was one car that did everything perfectly, we would only see one car on the road, but we don't. Everybody cranks up these new Kia Stingers. Look at that. Great vehicle. Why doesn't everybody buy one? Well, because there's a lot of great choices on the market. Toyota. If the RAV4 is the epitome of perfection, why doesn't everybody buy one of those? Because there's choice. Range Rover, the epitome of luxury. If you're a well-heeled, rich business person, you have lots of deep wallets, why isn't that the only vehicle you're buying? Many would argue that that's probably the only vehicle you would want to own. See, but I've owned over 100 cars, trucks, SUVs in my lifetime. Sports cars, useless cars, utility vehicles. And in that time, I've learned that every vehicle does something a little differently. Trucks, you need to haul some goods around. The truck is going to do your work for you. But who would have ever thought manufacturers like the likes from Japan, Toyota, Nissan, would create trucks that would counter and be more reliable and do better work than even what we're seeing from Ford, General Motors, Dodge, Ram. See, we never thought we'd get to a point where now a Dodge truck costs more money than a premium BMW. My, have things changed. The world has flipped on its head. See, because now these manufacturers, well, they were clever. They used to build products that represented value in some way. And one thing I learned was, you just have to figure out what that value is. Do you need to haul? Do you need to look fun, rich, luxurious? Are you going off-roading? Do you want to look sporty? Do you want to look like you've got money? Do you just want to get from A to B reliably? Every vehicle sort of has that value proposition, or used to have that value proposition. See, what I've learned is the delineation now is much, much tighter. See, because now you get sports cars that look like family cars, hence BMW M cars. Here, another classic example, Mercedes-Benz C63. It's a sports car dressed in a suit. Mercedes. It used to be if you bought a Mercedes, it meant you made it. It meant that it was the epitome of luxury, performance, style. But it's not really like that anymore. And Mercedes now are creating cars that are cheaper than a premium or a mid-level Honda or Toyota. So what has happened to this market? The luxury car market is building mainstream cars. Mainstream car manufacturers are building luxury vehicles. Think Hyundai Palisade and those types of vehicles. You're thinking some of the premium Toyotas and upscale everyday vehicles now are building more luxury vehicles, and that line is becoming blurred between luxury, performance, style, everyday, reliability. All of those things seem to be going out the window. And so many years ago, growing up, when I started driving, I think way back in, I don't know, I think back in the early, well, probably the mid 80s, when I first got my driver's license, I started driving cheap cars. See, one thing that you learn along the way is when you buy a cheap car, a lot of people think, hey, that's a great deal. This is another thing I learned along the way. A lot of people believe that a cheap car is a good deal. But usually a cheap car is just on the contrary. It's the last thing you would consider as a good deal. See, ask yourself this question, and I figured this out the hard way. I've driven those cars. I bought used cars that I thought were great deals. I bought a little Fiat. Seemed like a great deal at the time, back in the 80s. Well, what I found out was it had a blown head gasket, needed a clutch, wheel bearings were shot. It pretty much needed thousands of dollars of repairs. But at the time, I thought it was a good deal. I also realized I thought a good deal represented in a relatively low mileage BMW. I soon found out after the fact that the way a vehicle is treated is much more a representation of what you're going to expect for the future of that vehicle rather than miles itself. See, a lot of people assume low mileage means that you're going to get a quality vehicle. But I've seen people at an autocross in a 911 blow out a clutch in 100 kilometers just by taking their car to the track. See, a good deal is rarely truly a good deal. And like a lot of people say, you've heard the adage, a cheap BMW or any luxury car, and we can pretty much throw anything in the mix there, is one of the most expensive cars you'll own. See, because people know what they own. People know what they drive. People know what they have. And the expectation is, if they're not willing to put the money in, they're basically going to cut their losses and sell the car. Instead of putting those thousands of dollars of repairs into it, they either try to pull a fast one on you or me, or they just realize and say, look, full disclosure, the car needs this A, B, C, D, E, and I'll sell it for way, way cheaper. See, this is something that a lot of us think a cheap deal is a good deal in the car industry, and it rarely is. And so you've really got to think about what I figured out over the years was, what's the priority for your drive? What are you trying to get out of the driving experience? You want something luxurious? You're always going to pay to play. That's the other conversation here, because a lot of people sort of assume that, you know what, I can get into a luxury car or I can get into this great sports car and I can do it cheaply. But where I've realized over the years is that nothing cheap is worth owning, really, when it comes to cars. And when I say that, A to B, you can buy a cheap car. I mean, you can buy an old worn out Corolla that still has another 150,000 miles packed under the hood. Is it worth owning? See, not to me as much. Some people find their value in driving that $500 car and getting another 200,000 miles out of it. But one thing that I've learned along the way is, you know, it's a short life that we live. And it's easy just to say, you know what, I don't need to buy that cheap and dirty car. I don't need that expensive car. I don't need that sports car. I don't need that luxury car. You've got to figure out for yourself along the way what driving means to you. And in my 40 years, I've learned a few key elements of what driving means to me, and that's really dictated a big, the whole attitude shift on the types of vehicles I buy, the kind of vehicles I own, and how long I keep them for is all based on my personal interests. And everybody has their own needs and wants and interests. I'm willing to spend the additional maintenance costs on a car like this, but I also am not fooled believing that it's going to be cheap to run. See, a lot of people easily are mistaken and assume that maybe I can get into this 5 Series BMW with, you know, this twin turbo 6-cylinder engine and assume life's going to be good, and yeah, I'll just take care of it, it'll be good. But there's bigger forces at work. And there's a lot of cars out there that just are not good machines. But there's one thing that I've learned about this, and I've owned cars that are probably arguably some of the worst, most unreliable cars on the planet. But I did it knowing what to expect. See, nobody buys a Ducati motorcycle either with the assumption that it's going to be the most reliable. Why wouldn't everybody buy a Yamaha or a Honda? Well, because a Ducati's a Ducati. It delivers on the goods in other ways. The value proposition is performance, style, sound. That's why people buy cars like this. And that's what I've learned. While I value having reliable cars, I even more value the drive, the experience. In 40 years, I realized I'm not here forever. Also in 40 years, I realized that, you know, we spend our whole life carving out, hacking our way through life, paying bills, buying goods, low quality goods. I mean, look at all the goods people are blowing on Amazon. I mean, you throw that money online, you go shopping, next thing you know, put your credit card down, and that little box shows up at your doorstep. But see, one thing that I've learned about cars over the years is that a lot of people are totally on the fence and on the beliefs that a Honda is the only car you should drive, or a Toyota, or a Mitsubishi. Why? Because it's reliable. Okay, that's great, it's reliable. But then what? You ask the question, and I've asked people this, why would you buy that car? Well, it's reliable and it'll save me money and maintenance. Okay, well, that's a great point, and I could not agree more. To have a car that doesn't spend time in the shop is a great attribute. I don't like my cars spending too much time in a shop. I'd rather drive them. But what we've realized too over these years is you can't take everything for face value. I had a Jaguar F-Type, which was part of the JLR group, which was more reliable than some Hondas I've owned. Weirdly. Sure, the service costs were a little higher, but it wasn't abnormally unreliable. Now people are buying a Honda by default. They're not even thinking about it. They're assuming that they're getting a good quality vehicle. But again, taking it at face value is one of the biggest mistakes. See, people are going out there throwing $80,000, $70,000 on brand new Toyota Tundras, only to find out that they've got a blown engine. This is happening because people don't necessarily do their homework. And if there's one thing that I've learned in the car space, in the car industry, is that, again, you can't take it for face value. But then ask yourself, what is that value proposition? And if that value proposition is one which says, I want reliable, I want cheap to run, why do you want cheap to run? What is the driving factor there? Well, because it's money saved. Right. But then many of these people that I've spoken to are people that quite often spend their money on the goods that show up your doorstep. They waste it away on other frivolous expenditures. And while, on the flip side, People are trying to put money away from 401ks, TFSAs, RRSPs, trying to save money for a future, trying to save money for a rainy day, trying to save money for retirement at some point. And then they'll go blow it on a car that they didn't research, or on some low quality goods that show up at the doorstep. See, a lot of people simply do not do their homework, and that's one thing that I've learned over the years. You can't take everything for face value, because after owning over 100 vehicles, I've owned European vehicles, Italian, Fiat, Japanese, Hondas, Toyotas. I've owned Fords. I've had some Fords, diesels, gas. I've had Rams, Dodge. I've had Chevys. I've had all kinds of products from every single brand pretty much. And in many cases, I went on the assumption that the reliable brand was going to do me well. And in many cases, those reliable brands ended up being a much bigger money pit, to which I ended up throwing the vehicle away. See, because a lot of times we just go on face value. We're either fast talked, or you read a magazine, or you hear somebody talk, oh yeah, buy a Toyota, it's reliable. Boy, I buy a Honda, it's reliable. Sure, there's some very reliable Toyotas and Hondas. But there's some very reliable non-Toyota and Honda brands too. That said, everything's getting so expensive. And so if there's one thing I kind of want to say after learning from driving for 40 years, that you've got to figure out what your value proposition is. What matters to you when you're buying your next car? If you're buying it because you like the way it looks, super. Let's face it. I mean, you like to feel good and go out there and polish your car up on a Sunday afternoon. But if you like to buy a car because you feel it's going to stay out of the garage or out of the service shop, then obviously some of these cars may not fit the bill. But there's many other cars out there that will, and that people are influenced into buying something that they had no real feeling or belief that they should buy. Which takes us to another component of what I've learned in the last 40 years. Sales. See, salespeople that are selling you a car are selling you a car on the assumption that you're there to spend their money or your money. And they're going to try to have you spend as much money as possible. And salespeople will sell you just about anything they need to maximize the money that they take home. It's a business. And it's a living they're trying to make. So while we want to help facilitate that, if you're buying a new car or a used car off a car lot, you know that you're actually helping somebody sustain a living. Now that's fine. But you also don't want to be fast talked into something and duped into something that you had no intention on buying. And so too many people do that. Another thing that I've learned is what people do is they'll go out there and they don't even have a clue what they really want, but then they go shopping and they look at all these shiny new cars on the car lot, and then they start shopping, trying, perusing, test driving. See, that's another thing that I learned over the years. That's one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And I used to make those kind of mistakes. It's nice to just go look around. The worst thing you can say is walk into a car lot and say, hey, look at this, this is cute. Salesperson comes up to you and they say, anything we can help you with? And you say, I don't know, I just started looking. I'm kind of looking around, maybe looking for an SUV or a car. And if you're very vague, that's when they've got you rooked. That's when you're going to pay more than you ever planned. And that's when you're probably going to get into something that you didn't bargain for. See, because over the years driving, how many years of different models I've driven, I've realized that you pretty much just got to figure it out. You've got to know what you want, research it, figure it out, know that there is an expectation of maintenance, repairs, and it's not going to be perfect. But what's your value? See, for me, I'm okay in buying something that's maybe a little less than reliable if it delivers on the performance. I mean, I've driven Lamborghinis, I've owned Lambos and Porsches. And I've driven those cars, and not because they're reliable, and I'm not going to fool anybody. The value proposition was one which I knew would be for the sound driving experience. And a lot of people just don't necessarily really tap into what that expectation is. They don't tap into what their true value proposition is. If they're truly, say, a retiree, and they know that they're on a very limited budget, and they don't have a lot of income, and they're on a fixed income, and they really can't afford monthly payments, well, a value proposition to them might look like reliable and low running costs. But somebody hot to trot, somebody coming up in the wings, somebody maybe possibly in their 30s and 40s, you know, new to a career, up and comer, possibly wearing a suit every day, wants to feel good, likes to get out there and mingle with the car folks and go to the clubs and the meets. They're probably looking for something a little flashier and more fun, not to show off. Because from my take is, this is another one of those expectations, and one of those thoughts that I've learned is that you should always buy what's best for you, not best for those other people that are looking at you drive by. Because while it may seem cool to you to buy this because you think somebody's going to be impressed by what you're driving, that's when so many people get snookered. And I've learned over the years to not give two hoots about what anybody thinks. Rather, I'd rather drive something that delivers on the goods. How does it drive, handle, sound, perform? See, that's my oral senses. That's how I see a car, a truck, an SUV, a motorcycle. What does it deliver for me? Not for somebody driving by looking at it, because those people you don't even know and really don't care anyway. So what I've learned is, drive it for you, don't drive it for somebody else. But so too many people get caught up worrying about it, what everybody else thinks. And I've been totally fine with avoiding that. And that's one thing. Over the 40 years, I've made those decisions based largely on how I drive, how I like, the things I like and enjoy in a vehicle, rather than what the press is saying, what's the hottest new car of 2020, or what's the best new SUV for 2022. I don't care what others are saying. I listen, I research, and if it fits the bill, sure, let's take a look. But one thing I learned is people just sort of buy and they get swayed like the masses. And that's easy to do in the car market. So another thing that I've learned as well is car parts and repairs. And over the years, how I've managed to own cars like this: Jaguars, BMWs, Mercedes, Ferraris, Porsches, you name it. I've driven and owned just about everything. And how I've done that is, especially when I was younger and I didn't have the income, I realized that you've got to figure out, how am I going to afford to maintain these cars? Well, you should have thought about that before, but for me the priority was to drive the fun cars, and that was my value proposition. But now, how am I going to actually look after it? How am I going to afford these parts, and how am I going to afford the servicing? Well, now you become a product of your environment. And see, that's one thing that I've learned over the years, is I now am a product of the environment of which I've chosen to enter into, which is buying that car that I find is fascinating to drive and makes it's such a wonderful driving experience. And so now, instead of letting the cheap maintenance cost be my sole driver and my sole motivating factor, the driving experience is my motivating factor, not the maintenance. But that rather, now as a product of my environment, I'm realizing that, okay, I don't have open-ended pockets. I don't have the 7-figure payroll. So I better learn how to fix this thing now. I've got this car, I've got this Mercedes, this BMW. Now I better figure out how to fix it. See, because so too many people now get caught up in that game, where they want the flash and dash, and then they have to either pitch it because they can't afford it after a summer, because they buy this fancy sports car and then they realize at the year end they better get rid of it because they can't afford to maintain it, store it, service it, whatever, and then they have to sell it. How many cases have you seen where you're shopping for a car and that person's literally owned it for a year or 6 months? That's hilarious. That tells you one thing. It missed the boat on value proposition, or they simply could not afford it. So rather, what I realize is I'd much rather learn how to wrench, fix some of these cars myself, and keep all of those maintenance costs within a box that I can afford. If I can't afford a Bugatti Veyron, I'm not buying one, even if I could afford it up front. If I can't maintain if I can't look after the maintenance costs, I'm not buying that. But so too many people get caught up. Their eyes are bigger than their wallets. They buy a car that they can't afford, and then they get into trouble. Or even worse, what we're starting to see now, what I've learned in the 40 years is, back in the day, we would buy cash, or we might take out a 2-year loan for $250, $300, and we'd have that car paid off in 2 or 3 years, and it was almost new. But now, instead, what you're finding is, because the sheer cost of these vehicles today, people now are spending way more than they should ever even consider. While it's beautiful to have this great shiny new pickup truck, here we have this Denali, which is weird. Denalis usually have the 6.2, but that's fair. 5.3 it says on there. The point is, people want these flashy new vehicles, which is cool. But how do you afford it? And getting into these big car payments is something that I've been learning and seeing along. People are getting into real trouble. 84-month, 96-month car terms. I mean, 6, 7, 8 years for a car loan. As soon as they take it off the lot, because of the depreciation, they're into negative equity. So now they can't sell it, or they're losing money. Not just losing money, but they actually have to give more money to the lending, or when they go to trade it in, they actually have to give more money as a top-up on top of their trade-in value of that vehicle, because now it's, say, 3 years old and they want to trade it in, but because they took out such a long loan term with such little dollars down, now they're in a position where they actually have to give extra money. They take this car, they want to trade it in, and they actually owe more money, that and some cash, just to trade it in for its trade-in value. It's tragic when people go negative equity or upside down. And so if there's one thing I've learned in my 40 years, always live within your means. It's good to afford that sports car, that pickup truck, or that fancy luxury vehicle. It's great to afford all that. Figure out your value proposition. But if there's one thing that I've always lived with, the notion, always live within your means. And don't bite off more than you can chew.